ready to keep you company wherever you are. Carte Blanche, the podcast, brings you immersive, hard-hitting stories anytime, anywhere, every week.
It's Monday, and that means we have another episode of the WholeWeek Wrap with Daily Maverick and Carte Blanche. This week, we bring you a slightly longer wrap as we delve into the many geopolitical issues you should be keeping an eye on. With the BRICS summit happening in August, is it worth the political headache? And why is French President Emmanuel Macron so keen on attending? Then another summit you've probably never heard of that could lead to even more fallout.
It's not been announced as far as I've seen, but I've been told that President Ramaphosa is going to attend. There was some doubt about that. And that's obviously not going to go down too well in the West either.
And finally, we end things off with our usual green shoot as we look at how local entrepreneurs are going big with the very small black soldier fly. Welcome to another episode of the WholeWeek Wrap with Daily Maverick and Carte Blanche. I'm your host, Lizanne Jansen van Rensburg, and joining us today for this special episode is journalist and analyst on foreign policy issues, Peter Fabricius. Peter, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Lizanne. You?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure.
So we've touched briefly on various issues relating to South Africa's position on the Ukraine war and the major developments that came from it, such as the upcoming BRICS summit and the African peace mission to the Ukraine and Russia. But could you bring it home for us? Why should South Africans actually care about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine? Because you would be surprised to see how many times we get comments from people complaining about the fact that we're focusing on international issues and not local issues.
Yeah, it's often true, actually, what you say, to hear from normal people that they can't understand the focus on foreign policy because they don't think it touches them. However, this does really have quite a strong bearing, even if it is rather, I guess hard to detect and it's quite far away. I mean, Russia has invaded a small neighboring, democratic country, and it's flouted really one of the most fundamental principles of international relations, which is that you respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of other nations. And so that principle, if it's abandoned, could have consequences for other parts of the world, especially in Africa, by the way, where we live in a reasonably sort of volatile continent. And I mean, generally our conflicts haven't been along those lines interstate, they've been intrastate within states, but there's potential for that. It has happened in the past. And so, there are important principles at stake. And then the other reason why it's important for South Africa, of course, is that we've been sucked into the global politics surrounding Ukraine. I mean, we are in some danger of losing our preferential trade export into the very lucrative US market as a result of it, because the people in Congress and the US Congress have taken a strong exception to what they see as our pro-Russian stance. And that could lead to other sanctions. The Reserve Bank and the Treasury produced a report, or I think it was just the Reserve Bank, recently, in which they calculated that if secondary US sanctions are imposed on South Africa as a result of its stance on the Russia-Ukraine war, it could have catastrophic, was the word they used, consequences for the South African economy. It's just one of those huge issues that is massively important to Europe and the US, and it's sucking everybody else in.
I understand that we are fully entitled to have a stance on a matter and not be under pressure from other nations to change that stance. But what are your thoughts on South Africa's insistence that we're taking this neutral stance, even though it comes across as very far from neutral, let's be honest?
Yeah, at the beginning of the war, it looked like we were going to be taking they like to call it non-aligned rather than neutral, which is slightly different. I think what they mean by that is that they're not indifferent to the suffering of the Ukrainian people and the destruction of their infrastructure. But they're non-aligned, as during the Cold War. There are other nations in the world also, what used to be called the Third World is no longer, is the Global South, which is also non-aligned. And at the beginning, I think the Western nations kind of accepted that we abstained from a whole series of resolutions condemning Russia in the UN General Assembly. But then they they started seeing, and everybody started seeing signs actually of South Africa drifting closer towards the Russian side. The attendance of officials, including our defense minister at a Moscow security conference, the fact that ANC Youth League members participated as observers in these absolutely outrageous sort of what have been called sham referenda, forcing provinces of eastern Ukraine to be basically absorbed into Russia, and that got fully supported by the ANC Youth League. We had this infamous incident where the cargo ship, the Russian cargo ship Lady R, docked in Simonstown, and according to the US ambassador, uploaded arms for Russia. That's still being investigated by a kind of semi-judicial commission. And then we had this joint military exercise with the Russians and Chinese on the anniversary of the invasion. So there have been various signs that we are no longer non-aligned, and that has caused concern.
I think it's also important to also remind listeners, that South Africa is by no means the only African country sticking to this non-aligned / neutral stance. There are many other African countries who have also taken a very similar stance on this. So is this only because the African continent relies so heavily on grain and oil imports, or is there more to it? Like, what are we maybe not seeing?
There's a mixture of things. Our stance also comes as the result of a mixture of factors, and also in the rest of Africa. There is a kind of a historic, and I guess you could say quite well established sort of principle of non-alignment, which also dates back to the Cold War, before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But there are also ties that other African countries have with Russia. Some of them are similar, actually, to ours. They supported their liberation struggles against colonial masters. But there are also things like material commercial interests, like fertilizer, grain, and so on. It was very interesting to see, for example, a country like Kenya, where at the start of the war in Ukraine, the Kenyan minister or representative, actually, at the UN, made a really memorable speech, which a lot of people quote, basically telling Russia, look, you may think that Ukraine was once part of Russia back in the Soviet Union, but like we in Africa, you've got to get used to the fact that borders might not always be rational, but you have to accept them. That's the way it is. You forget about history, concentrate on the present. But since then, and especially now under the new president, William Ruto, Kenya's also taken a much more balanced view. And there is a suspicion that had to do with fertilizer concessions and contracts and so on, which were offered by the foreign minister Lavrov when he visited there a few months ago. So it's a mixture of things. Some African countries have voted quite strongly with the General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia. So in fact, more so than those who abstained. But in this continent, the proportion of countries that have abstained is higher than in other continents.
It's the summit no one is talking about. The Russia-Africa Summit is set to take place in St. Petersburg in Russia from the 27th to the 28th of July. And as with the BRICS Summit, the world will be watching, especially the US. There's been a lot of focus on the upcoming BRICS Summit in August, but there's another big summit that you're also keeping your eye on, the Russia-Africa Summit happening at the end of July. Can you tell us a bit more about this summit and what you expect from it? Because I don't think it's something that's currently on a lot of people's radars.
Yeah, it's the second such summit. The first one was in 2019. And basically what's happened is that Russia, which is very conscious of the fact, and this emerged at the time of the last summit, is conscious of the fact that it took its eye off the ball in Africa for a long time. It's supported all these liberation movements and so on, like the ANC and others, ZAPU in Zimbabwe and others in Southern Africa. And then you had the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union. You had the long period of utter chaos, really, in Russia under Yeltsin during the 90s. And then Putin, the strongman, comes back. It took a while, even since then, to begin to assert a kind of presence in Africa. And it's hard not to see it as being a response to everyone else. The EU has been having summits with Africa since 2000. China has. India started doing it, South Korea, whoever, So Russia felt it needed to get on the bandwagon, and so they had that summit. So really, in a way, it was a kind of symbolic exercise. I went to that summit. It was kind of largely a trade fair, really, in terms of, concrete events and things happening. But it was a symbolic way for Russia to say, we're back in Africa, and we're your friend. And of course, that was already after the initial invasions of Ukraine, in the Crimea. So it wasn't unrelated to the geopolitical context. So this now, again, especially in the context of the war, is making this summit very important. And one of the most important things, I think, is just going to be who attends. And it's not been announced as far as I've seen, but I've been told that President Ramaphosa is going to attend. There was some doubt about that. And that's obviously not going to go down too well in the West either. And then we're going to see who else goes. It's not quite clear who would. Probably a fairly large presence for the reasons that we already discussed. That probably a lot of African leaders are going to say, well, we want to keep both sides happy and, want to keep our options discussions open, but conscious of the fact that, others will be watching, the West will be watching very closely. Look, I'm waiting to see that gets officially confirmed, because we've been getting quite a lot of unreliable information leaking out on President Ramaphosa's movements and so on. You'd probably find that in the US, the administration, the Biden administration, would accept that. But, in Congress, there's a lot of Republicans who are very angry with South Africa, and these are the ones who've been issuing statements, making resolutions, and basically threatening to remove South Africa from AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, the one that gives us that duty-free access to the US market. So, that's going to be another, if President Ramaphosa does go, it's going to be another tick in the wrong side of the column, These are kind of accumulative factors which are going to weigh in on that decision. We're supposed to be having the AGOA Forum, which is the annual meeting of the countries that are eligible, about 30-something African countries. And that's supposed to be in South Africa in November. But, a bunch of very senior US senators and congressional leaders, House of Representatives leaders, wrote a letter to the Biden administration, that you probably would have seen a month ago or so, basically saying that they thought it should be taken away from South Africa, given its stance on Russia. So, that Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg will be a factor in those sort of considerations.
There's certainly a lot at stake just in terms of AGOA. And I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that as well. Just, do you think the US will follow through on threats that they might take AGOA away from us? Or do you think it's just a case of them trying to pressure us into taking their stance on the Russia matter and nothing will happen with AGOA in any case?
Actually, that's a very good question. And I don't 100% know the answer to that question. If you look at that letter I was referring to, and it was signed amongst others by Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, who's actually a friend of South Africa. He's been to this country a lot, and he's generally supportive of, for example, PEPFAR, that big program that fought AIDS here for the last 20 years. And so when he signed that, I thought, wow, that is quite seriously worrying. But if you looked at that letter, it was a little bit ambivalent, because it started off by saying, we don't think that this forum should take place in South Africa because of this and this, and the exercises with Russia, military exercises and so on. Then at the end, there's an if that comes, and it says, if South Africa does not modify its Russian stance, then the forum should be taken away. So in that sense, it did suggest some kind of pressure, and it was not quite clear what South Africa needs to do. Now, the one thing that I'm sure you were going to bring up, we have this retired judge who's been investigating what arms, if any, were loaded onto the Lady R and what were loaded off. If that report comes out, and it's due out quite soon, and says that, there were arms and so on, and South Africa doesn't do something drastic to remedy the situation, then I think we're over the edge in terms of that AGOA forum, and then further consequences in terms of our membership.
Is the BRICS summit becoming a greater liability for South Africa as member countries like Russia and China continue to push Western nations' buttons? While Peter doesn't believe President Ramaphosa will back out of the BRICS summit, he does warn that we're likely headed for some choppy waters. So I want us to also just quickly touch on BRICS, and more importantly, I want us to focus on France, because French President Macron has recently said that he's very keen on attending.
It was an interesting gesture. I mean, Macron is the kind of leader who likes to see himself as being a bit unorthodox and using unexpected and unconventional tactics. And so he right at the beginning of the war, for example, in Ukraine, he was the one who was trying to speak to Putin and talk him down and so on. And he's been to visit China. So he's like seeing himself as a bridge builder between the East and the West as they move dramatically further apart now as a result of this war. And so I think he thought, well, let's, why not? I mean, in the piece that I wrote, I said, and I quoted an expert on the G7 and the G20 and BRICS and so on, Ramaphosa always gets invited, except this year, oddly enough, to the G7 summits. And France invited him to the G7 summit, which it held in 2019. And so it's not a crazy illogical idea to return the compliment. In a certain sense, BRICS is like the G7 of the South. It kind of brings together the major economies of the South. And if you go to the G20, where the G7 is there and BRICS are there, they're like two sort of each representing a different, region of the world and discussing things in the G20 context. I think Macron was probably thinking, well, it would be a gesture, it'd be a gesture of reaching out, and as we reach out to invite, leaders like Ramaphosa and Modi of India and so on to G7 summits, balance, why not the opposite? And yet it's pretty clear that it's going to be vetoed by Russia and China, which would be a pity, I think, actually, because I thought that it would be quite an interesting moment to have a G7 leader attending a BRICS summit.
You also wrote in one of your more recent articles about the BRICS summit that it will likely become more of a liability for us than anything else. Is it too late for Ramaphosa to back out? Should he back out? What do you think is the best move for South Africa in terms of BRICS?
To be honest with you, in some ways, BRICS has seemed to be a fairly uncontroversial body for most of the time that we've been a member of it. But I've always thought right from the beginning that by joining a body in which Russia and China are so dominant, and both of them having like geopolitical ambitions and both being quite assertive and, you could say potentially, or in Russia's case, actually quite aggressive in terms of their foreign policy, that we were going to get sucked into those kind of things. And that's precisely what's happened in Russia. And there's a danger of that happening with China and Taiwan. If China were to attack Taiwan, which a lot of people expect it might do, we'd be going through all this again, So what I was trying to say, there was a bit of a throwaway line in that piece. I was trying to say in a way that I think that what's happening now with this embarrassment and all this tension over whether Putin will attend the BRICS summit or not, I was saying that BRICS is beginning to shift from being an asset on balance, you could say, to a liability. Because you look at our relations with those countries, what do they mean? Our relations with the West are way more important in terms of exports and balance of trade and so on. We trade a lot with China, but it's not very beneficial trade, to be honest. It's mainly in raw materials. Okay, that's also a factor. It's useful and it pushes the commodity prices up. But the trade with Western countries is much more balanced. So there's more, we export more manufacturing goods, which is good for jobs and generally balance of trade, balance of payments. So it's, I was just putting it out there that maybe to answer your question directly, I don't think that Ramaphosa is going to pull out of it, but it's becoming increasingly difficult, I think, to be. And we have the issue that coming up at the summit of membership, expanded membership, which could be controversial too, because if certain countries like Iran and so on join, there's a danger, I think, that BRICS becomes more and more of a kind of anti-Western bloc, which it isn't quite at the moment.
Saffron, snails, mopani worms, bambara nuts, and now black soldier flies. When it comes to the farming sector in South Africa, entrepreneurs are proving once again that anything is possible. Here's this week's feel-good story. We've really covered a lot in today's episode, but I want to kind of end things off with a green shoot, as we always do. And this one's a bit different, and it's about a Cape Town-based company that's farming with black soldier flies, a high source of protein, and they plan on exporting these to the EU and elsewhere. And this just got me thinking about other products and resources that are often overlooked, I think, in our country that could become a saving grace for our struggling economy. I remember we did an amazing story on saffron farming in South Africa, and last year we reported on young farmers and entrepreneurs embracing mopani worms and bambara nuts. Do you think industries like these could uplift communities and then also on a more grand scale push our economy forwards?
Yeah, that is quite an intriguing little account, wasn't it? And apparently they have already begun exporting to the EU and the US. And there is this huge protein shortage in the world, and it seems to be fairly innocuous in terms of impact on the environment and, biodiversity and all that, as far as one can tell. What it says to me in a way is that you have to create environments, economic environments, in which entrepreneurs like this who come up with what we might think are rather crazy ideas are given an opportunity to pursue them. There's no way that any government economic planning commission is going to say, what we haven't done yet, what we haven't really exploited is the potential of the black soldier fly. That requires some entrepreneur who's just got a mind in another place, and then it requires an environment created by the state and which encourages that, which permits that, which liberates his entrepreneurial eccentricity, shall we say.
I was also thinking, there's no ways that our government bodies are discussing the viability of soldier flies as a viable economic sector, So I love that people are coming up with these ideas and really pushing forwards with them, and that they're successful. That makes me happy. When they're successful, proves that, anything is possible, really.
I was actually wondering whether he doesn't have AGOA access, because if he's exporting that stuff to the US, potentially that's
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. Well, that's it for today's weekly wrap. It's been such a pleasure chatting to you, and really getting a broader perspective on SA's place within a global context, because we've tried to kind of touch on all of these aspects, but we really couldn't get into this depth as much as we have today. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Suzanne. It was really good to sound off. You know?
It was lovely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And that's a wrap. In case you missed any of our previous chats with Daily Maverick, you can find them all on Carte Blanche, the podcast, available on Spotify and all major podcasting platforms.